Resident Evil is a very large and long-running franchise that really redefined the genre of survival horror. And due to this, fans have grown to love it and find a very special place in their heart for it. And one of the most beloved in the series, that some would regard as the series' magnum opus, is Resident Evil 4.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
This was quite genre-defining in its own right. I mean, without it, we probably wouldn't have games like Dead Space, or at least the same version of Dead Space that we all know and love. So over the years, as the franchise grew and expanded, we saw it go in all sorts of directions, from video games to animated films, to not-so-great live-action adaptations, to really not-so-great live-action adaptations, and as the franchise grew, so did we. But with Resident Evil 4 being as praiseworthy as it is, the holy grail of gaming,
I'll buy it at a high price.
Many people begun to speculate whether or not we needed a remake. And let's be real, this conversation comes up a lot, no matter what game it is really. But especially with the gargantuan, or should I say, El Gigante size of a game that is Resident Evil 4, it was, and still is, hotly debated. And that is exactly what we're here to answer today, whether or not Resident Evil 4 Remake holds a candle to the original game. But in order to answer that, we need to first ask this. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Wait, no, that's not right. The chicken or the snake? No, that's not right either. Oh, right, of course. The snake or the chicken egg?
No, that's not it.
Resident Evil is a lot like that because the chicken lays the egg gets swallowed by the snake gets killed by Leon, and the egg gets eaten by Leon, restoring his health. And that is Resident Evil 4 Remake. Let me explain. This should go without saying that Resident Evil Village is directly influenced by Resident Evil 4, because, of course, all the elements of the story to the gameplay and the environments, the DNA is all there. You have a blonde man who ends up in Europe, searching for and looking to rescue a young girl who got abducted by the local cult. As said blonde man, you first make your way through the village where you are overwhelmed by not exactly zombies, but zombie-adjacent creatures until they are distracted. You also make your way through several places like a giant castle where you meet a number of strange and zany characters, including a giant fish monster.
There's always a bigger fish.
And a merchant who happens to appear anywhere and everywhere you go. And despite Resident Evil Village not getting the best reception in terms of story, I actually quite enjoyed it for what it's worth. It may have not been the best in the series, but it was a damn good time. Either way, there's a lot in Resident Evil Village that was pulled from Resident Evil 4. But in the process, with all these remakes and the new RE engine that these games run on, they took some of that inspiration and all the things that work from it and put it into the Resident Evil 4 remake, essentially restoring all the fans back with that pivotal shift we saw all the way back in 2005. The remake is a reimagining of the original from 2005, and it does take the game in some creative directions that some purists may not take a liking to, but there are no significant changes to the main plot or the characters, or anything really. Most of what made the original so great remains intact, and I will go as so far as to say that this takes an already great game and elevates it tenfold. I know 2005's Resident Evil 4 is incredibly beloved and is not seen as outdated to many people, but for newcomers to the series, I do think that this was a necessary decision for Capcom to make. While I wouldn't say this is aged poorly, because it's still perfectly playable in my opinion, the remake is far more accessible to newer fans, especially with the last two remakes being a jumping off point. The biggest thing that held the original back were definitely the controls. While it was a standard for the time, it definitely was difficult to get used to these older controls, even for me a couple of years ago, to the point where I had to quit a number of times because I just felt like I couldn't get a handle on it, and it unfortunately left a bad first impression on me. For most people, you will find that this first area is arguably the most difficult part of the game, in both this and the remake. And although it does technically get more difficult as the game progresses, this first area serves as a tutorial, teaching you the ins and outs of how to play, and by the time you conquer it, you probably now have a solid grasp on the controls and the intensity that follows. But when I played through the original, it took me a long time to beat that first area, primarily because, for one, I absolutely suck at video games, and I'm not afraid to admit that. And two, I had grown so accustomed to more modern games where you can move and aim as you please, where you're not limited to the camera or the direction that you're facing. But after a number of times trying to reapproach it, I finally got my bearings and actually found myself enjoying the game. With that being said, I still think that the implementation of the camera and tank controls is still enough of a reason to warrant this remake, to appeal to newer fans who are used to more modern controls. This isn't the only change that they've made, but it would be enough. Like how I mentioned in the Dead Space remake review, if the only significant change was making Isaac speak, that would already make it 10 times better. Similarly, If they only allowed for free movement while aiming and no other changes or additions were made, that would also already make it 10 times better. However, of course, these differences do not end there, and there are a number of changes that you may want to consider if you haven't picked it up yet. Like I said, none of these changes are really all that significant anywhere else, but they are present nonetheless. Aside from the most obvious change being the fact that it runs on a newer engine with modern and polished graphics, the game also takes it a step further by changing up portions of each and every level. There were many moments where I couldn't recall where I was in relation to the original game until a cutscene or a particular story beat suddenly triggered my memory. In other words, environments aren't one-to-one, but they are very reminiscent of the original, and I do think this change is one that is justified, as it leaves some surprises for even longtime fans. I constantly found myself saying, "What is this place?"
What is this place?
What is this place?
It is also justified, as each level and area not only feels bigger, but is bigger too. The levels are much more open and spacious, and I think that this helps with the game's immersion. Capcom also added side missions that you can complete that reward you with spin-offs. You can use them to purchase different types of gear and even treasure. And now with the treasure, you can inlay gemstones with varying combinations to boost its value. One of the side missions that returns are the blue medallions, which are relatively easy to find if you follow them on the map, although some of them can be a bit tricky. But luckily, you won't have to go too far to find them. But in terms of sheer scope and size, there is one chapter in the game where you are able to roam and explore quite a bit to complete some of these side missions. It felt as though Capcom took a page out of Santa Monica's book in that way. The game is also going for a darker tone, which is consistent with Remake 2 and 3Make, and in an attempt to make it darker, much of the zaniness is lost, but not to a significant degree either, as all of what is necessary is still present. While lots of the cheesy dialogue has been axed,
No thanks, bro.
there is still some here and there, but nowhere near as much. But the bingo line stays at least.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And sure, a lot of it is gone and will be missed, but what's more cheesy than the big cheese himself, Chief Mendez? Mendez, alongside most of the characters, remains mostly the same. The only differences you may notice are now in Salazar's new redesign. His right hand no longer comes off, only Ethan's does. Ada's voice, which I've seen tons of people complain about, I think it's totally fine. And the Merchant's voice.
Over here, stranger.
The Merchant's voice is probably one of the most iconic voices, so it might take a little bit of getting used to, but I do like at least that most of the lines stay the same, even if it isn't quite delivered the same. But that's also just a very minor nitpick. The Ganado character models have changed too. They feel a bit more varied and feel a little less copy-pasty, even though they still kind of are. One very welcome change though is Ashley Graham. She has been notoriously known to be one of the most annoying characters in the history of video games, but here they made sure to reverse that. There are still escort missions with her, but they aren't nearly as grueling or annoying. Ashley can actually somewhat stand her ground. She isn't getting caught every second and isn't calling out to Leon quite the same. I also think that with both Ashley and Leon checking in on each other to see how they are is very endearing, and helps the player better connect with these two characters. It's a good way to develop an emotional connection to them, and also makes effective companion-type characters like we've seen in Bioshock Infinite and The Last of Us. Speaking of companions, there are a few times where you will have Louise as your companion, and the AI here is actually really well done, and he is super helpful in clearing out waves of enemies. There were a few parts in particular in the original game that were really quite frustrating, but here, with the tuned AI, it makes those sections significantly easier. Let's talk difficulty. If we're comparing to the original, the game is about the same, or maybe a tad bit more difficult in certain areas, but the addition of free movement, as mentioned earlier, and the ability to parry attacks evens out the playing field. These tweaks can be massive lifesavers on their own, as if you're struggling or backed into a corner, not all hope is lost. You can also now use stealth to sneak up behind enemies and attack them with one of your knives. The knives do have a durability system, so they are prone to break after a certain number of uses. But don't worry, there are tons of knives to find scattered throughout the game, and you do have the option to repair or even upgrade its durability when visiting the merchant. For newer players who lack context to the difficulty in the original, the game is not very difficult to begin with, and I do think most people will be okay playing it on standard. Essentially, if you were okay with the difficulty in Resident Evil Village or the other two remakes, I think you should be okay. But if you do find yourself still struggling, the game does allow you to lower the setting once you have died. But there is a small caveat here. If you do choose to lower it, and say play unassisted, it cannot be changed back. While it would have been nice to have a difficulty slider to change it at will, as I do find that the difficulty spikes in certain areas, particularly during boss fights, at least like in the original, if you got the coin, you can use your one-time use handy-dandy rocket launcher to essentially skip certain fights. In this game, there are a number of weapons to select from and buy as long as you can fit them in your inventory, but learning to manage which weapon loadout works best for you is one of the key elements to pretty much every survival horror game. My personal go-to weapon of choice was the Red 9, just like it was in the original. It was the one that I used most of the time, but occasionally would switch to one of my shotguns in more intense moments or on particular enemy types. In the original, I would also often use my knife as they climbed up in order to save ammo. I even used it in one boss fight, if you know you know, for that reason as well. But here, because it's prone to break, I did it fewer times. Resident Evil 4 is an iconic game that redefined the survival horror genre, and its influence can be seen in many other games that followed. While the idea of a remake was contested among fans, the Resident Evil 4 remake more than proved its worth, and does justice to the original by taking the game in creative directions while also keeping the main plot and characters intact. Along with the changes in the environments, those character changes ultimately do not change anything in the long run, and in some cases, are improvements. These effectively made some important moments and character dynamics much more impactful. The game is much more accessible to new fans with updated controls and a more modern polish. Even though some purists may not take a liking to the changes, the remake elevates an already great game to a new level. It took me nearly 17 hours to roll credits, which was a few short of how long I spent in the original, but typically, on average, this game should run you about 15 to 25 hours. The Resident Evil 4 remake is a necessary decision by Capcom to introduce a new generation of gamers to this classic game. They say don't put all your eggs in one basket, but Capcom put all their eggs in one attaché case, and they succeeded.